discussing free will, philosophers talk about mind, neuroscientists talk about the brain, and ordinary people talk about their subjective experiences and intuitions about free will. Philosophers have been interested in free will for thousands of years. It goes back to the very beginnings of philosophy and science in ancient Greece. All the major philosophers from the 19th century, continental philosophers to modern analytic philosophers, have their own ideas about free will. And this is probably because our ideas about free will stem from our deep appreciation of the concept of mind. We learned from the time that we were children that minds cause things to happen. We learned to distinguish from an instance where some winds knocked something over and where the wind knocked something over. And when philosophers speak about free will, they generally mean the power to perform actions, the power to do something or to not do something. And indeed, common intuitions about free will presupposes this power when we speak of blaming ourselves or other people or traffic or the weather or whatever. And this emphasis on blame brings out the idea that we tend to think in retrospect that we could have done otherwise than we might have in a given set of circumstances. For instance, say I'm walking across McCarthy Quad and I stop to consider whether I should buy some coffee at Trojan Grounds. It really feels like I have options here, like I could do this or that, like I'm choosing between alternatives. But notice that this sort of thinking actually presupposes that I do, in fact, have the power to willfully choose my actions, and that my choices are not, in other words, determined by external circumstances. Now, this idea has been challenged in recent years by findings in neuroscience and psychology. But I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to say a few things about determinism. So if I drop this laser pointer right now, from the moment it leaves my hand, we can pretty much, with 100% accuracy, predict that it will fall to the ground. Obviously, no one would argue that a laser pointer has free will, but I'm going to present evidence that suggests that human decisions and choices actually work in a similar way as the very predictable law of gravity. Ever since the development of the scientific method, the various branches of science have increasingly demystified the world. With the exception of certain theories in quantum physics, science has confirmed that the world operates according to consistent laws. We've come to learn that nature is like a machine, even if it is an enormously complex one. But up until recent decades, we've been reluctant to exercise the full extent of the scientific method, because even though we accept that the world operates mechanistically, even though our bodies function mechanistically, we're not, or at least we're disinclined to admit that our minds operate mechanistically. But when you consider your own life, it seems pretty hard to rule out the possibility that everything is interconnected. For instance, I woke up this morning at 9 because my alarm went off then. My alarm went off because I set it to go off at 9. I set it to go off the night before because I decided to wake up at 9. I decided to wake up because I wanted to have time this morning to prepare for right now. You can go on like this ad nauseum, and every time you try to think of an uncaused event, you can always think of a cause or a set of circumstances that led to a certain outcome. But still, I and all of you have a very strong conviction that we do possess free will, whatever that means. Many of the experiences in our daily lives seem to confirm this idea. So the issue of free will really comes down to a tension between freedom and causation. Now let's have the neuroscientist weigh in. From Francis Crick, in a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, in it he writes, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. We can accept the truth of this and still hold on to the idea that we freely choose our actions because free will and determinism seem to involve time and self-directed action, but this leads us to wonder just what on earth we mean by a self. It's also worth noting that the vast majority of neural processes are actually unconscious. Something like 99%, I mean, this is the number I just made up, 99% of your brain processes are unconscious. So we're arguing over this remaining 1% or even 1/100% that's left over. But this remaining portion really means everything to us. It's our thoughts and our conscious feelings and beliefs and decisions. And a scientist named Benjamin Libet in the 1980s conducted a famous experiment in which he claimed to prove causal determinism and disprove free will. The results were discredited because the data were flimsy, but it's been replicated in, starting in 2008, again, a guy named Haynes took up this work, and a neurosurgeon in Germany at the Max Planck Institute also worked on individual neurons. And all of this has corroborated Libet's findings. So for the sake of simplicity and time, let's just look at Libet's original graph. So the idea here is that the subject, the person being experimented on who had electrodes on their head, was supposed to raise their finger whenever they felt like it, and to note this time on a clock up there, and to tell Libet when they felt the urge to raise their finger. So we have the time when they raised their finger and the time when they felt the urge to raise their finger. And the surprising result is that brain activity in the subject's frontal lobe actually peaks before they felt the conscious desire to raise their finger. So you can see here that the conclusion that the neuroscientists came to is that brains initiate supposedly voluntary actions non-consciously. In other words, conscious decisions to perform an action come after the brain has already decided. So why on earth do we feel this strong conviction that we have free will? Well, for one thing, the brain is modular, which means that various compartments in the brain process different types of information in parallel. And there's no central control room where all the information comes together. The brain is designed by evolution to make decisions, and so various brain regions constantly update themselves in real time. So it's more like this, a sort of overlapping layers of time rather than, a timeline, which works very well for chronologies, but not so well for the time on brain processes. Experiments like that don't actually prove anything, it seems, except that there's a characteristic pattern of brain activity associated with decision-making, just like there is with any other sort of brain process. So it really shouldn't be surprising, and some philosophers have pointed this out, as well as neuroscientists like Michael Gazzaniga. And to further illustrate the principle of modularity, here's a simplified diagram of how vision works. As you can see, it's not a matter of light streaming into your eye and then being represented as an image. Before you consciously apprehend an object in the external world, the input has been processed by various brain regions. Some pieces are sent back and reprocessed and sent over. Some things are amplified, other things are suppressed. Certain features of the image are distorted and changed, and this is the reason that we all see things in the world slightly differently. The modularity of brain, however, forces us to admit that there's no little man sitting inside our heads pulling levers and making things happen like in The Wizard of Oz. Now, there's more to be said about just why we feel that we have free will, and I'd like to quickly go through another experiment to get at this issue. So this one involves a split-brain patient, a person who's had their corpus callosum severed, so the two hemispheres of their brain can't share information across their corpus callosum. So the idea here is that the patient is staring at this dot. He's fixating at that, so that his right eye sees only the chicken foot, and his left eye sees only the snow scene. And remember that the visual pathway is crossed, so the image of the chicken foot is being represented in his left brain, the snow scene in his right brain. The patient is asked to match each of these pictures, the chicken foot and the snow scene, to cards in front of him. And keep in mind that language originates in the left side of the brain. It's a region called the interpreter region. And so the patient correctly matched the snow scene with the shovel and the chicken foot with the chicken. But because his brain was split, the image of the snow scene could not reach the language area of his brain. And when the scientists asked the man why he chose the card with the chicken and the card with the shovel, he said, "Oh, that's easy. The chicken foot goes with the chicken," and he looks down at his left hand pointing at the shovel for a minute, kind of confused, before he said, "And you need a shovel to clean up the chicken shit." But my point here is that we have an innate desire to tell stories. It's how we make sense of our world and our place in the world. Punishment and reward, embarrassment, pride and accomplishment. None of these things would exist if we weren't hardwired to tell stories. So free will may be an illusion, but it's an illusion from which we cannot escape. And I think that Francis Crick is correct in saying that free will is not what we typically conceive it to be. But this should also be obvious when you consider the fact that the concept of free will isn't really relevant to neuroscience. It's a vestige left over from an age when philosophy didn't have to contend with science like it does today. The experiment that I shared with you analyzed a single brain in isolation. But if there was only one brain in the world, I don't think that it would be worried about free will. Remember that free will has to do with the power to act or not act, which refers to the interaction between people. We must keep the cellular level conceptually distinct from the molecular level, which in turn has to be kept distinct from the psychological level, which is the level of persons. And so on to the level of the entire cosmos. You can think of it in this way. Cars are mechanistic. We understand perfectly how engines work. Form relates precisely to function. But you can't possibly explain the complicated physics and dynamics of traffic by studying a car engine in isolation. So the concept of free will is relevant to persons, not to brains, not to neurons. No amount or type of data from neuroscience will ever be able to illuminate what a mind is or how this differs from neurochemical interactions in your head. So your brain isn't free, but you as a person are. Thank you.